Hey there, everybody. So, what you're about to listen to, because you can see there's no video, is my thoughts that I had given for the Barbie movie that just came out. It turned out to exceed my expectations greatly, and throughout it, there was just thoughts swarming through my head. It had a lot of parallels with my studies of gender through the work of Judith Butler recently, as well as my reading of Heidegger's Being in Time, and also my interest in the Hegelian master-slave dialectic, and my very surface-level understanding of Lacan. And I created a 17-minute voice memo that I did in my car after the movie to kind of collect my thoughts so that I could put them into an essay. And not sure if I'm going to do that essay still. Not that there's anything wrong with it, but I kind of got my thoughts out. And as such, what you're about to be presented with was originally just intended for myself. So I purposely don't go into a lot of detail on the terms that I'm using, which can make things a little bit difficult because I use words like phallogocentrism, and that term in particular may strike one as a little bit confusing and obtuse. And I just wanted to preface this by saying that phallogocentrism, first off, you have to know the idea of the phallus, which is the erect penis, kind of as a symbolic image and as an actual structuring of our language. And phallogocentrism, you can pick it apart: phallus and then logo, as in logos, and centrism. So this is a way which we are centered around. And of course, the logos has some ties to Christian thought and just philosophy in general. It's defined as an ordering principle, something that yields rationality. So the logos is, at least in Christian thought, is equated with Jesus, for example, because Jesus makes sense of the world by performing this function of dying for people's sins and completing the Trinity and all this other stuff. And that, according to Christian thought, Jesus is the lens by which people are able to have language and things like this. And that's kind of why Jordan Peterson says that that without Jesus you would have no language, or that without the logos you wouldn't have language, or something like this. So logocentrism is the idea that we are centered around rational principles, or around logic as our totalizing discourse, that we interpret things through the lens of being rational. This extends beyond just, for example, the laws of the universe. Like gravity is a rational principle because it adheres to all things, or at least that's what we think. Our current understanding of physics is kind of changing the way we think about rational laws, but we typically like to think that the universe is rationally constructed. So logocentrism is the idea that language and all this other stuff, meaning and human relations, is structured around a logical presumption that the world operates under logical principles. And phallogocentrism is the idea that language and meaning and human relations is structured around the phallus as the symbolic image that makes sense of things. So in a sense, this is the idea of a patriarchy, that men have created an institution that governs the way things are to be interpreted and the way women are treated, and takes this to a higher level to say that language in general is structured around the phallus and ensuring that it is given some sort of identity. In Gender Trouble, Judith Butler goes through great lengths to show, really just through elucidating Lacan's work, how we can interpret this through the master-slave dialectic, which I did a video on, if you would like to see. But basically saying how Lacan understands, identity in general to be a result of its impossibility, that the phallogocentric kind of economy of signs and meaning and stuff like this is just a system that is trying to hide from the fact that the phallus has created a system to bolster itself and make sense of masculinity and a gender binary that it institutes to make sense of the world. So that's a little bit of background that might help this make a little bit of sense. It could be helpful if you really want to understand this video to watch my video on the master-slave dialectic. Watching my videos on Baudrillard would help too if you want to check those out. And my video on Judith Butler's Gender Trouble is also quite critical to understanding this, but I think everyone can gain something from this. Just kind of a little bit of a forewarning that the thoughts are a bit scattered about without really being properly elucidated, because I didn't assume that I would be doing this for a general audience until I got to the end and I realized it kind of summed up my thoughts really well. So I hope you enjoy, and here it is. Okay, so ultimately, the whole movie is an anti-universalist claim, both to gender and to human nature. You can read kind of the surface level meta-narrative of the fight scenes and the typical plot devices, but then there's a level below that, which is that, you come into it assuming it's going to be a surface level feminist reading of Barbie's just not an individual. She learns to become a real woman, and the end, she topples the patriarchy. And there's lots of Lacanian subliminal messaging throughout. I think the most important is how it points to a phallogocentric discourse. You have the horses, for example, that recur over and over. You have the horses in the mountain. They do their galloping as a group of men towards the end as they go to confront Barbie for the last time before Ken cries. And obviously, the horse reference is a link to the phallus, like people talk about having a horse cock or something like this. And, the surface level feminist reading, or maybe not even surface level, is that women are defined precisely insofar as they are merely the signified in a phallogocentric discourse. So men are the universal and are the signified, and in kind of a way that Beauvoir would say, women are merely the negative by which male identity is ensured. And, all throughout there's men, it's almost turning the phallogocentric discourse around the other way, because in Barbie world, men are almost the oppressed ones, which is really weird. And I think that's kind of the moment for Ken, is that his individualization serves the feminist discourse by showing how it could happen the other way around. And it might actually increase the movie's reach by appealing to men in a sense, which you could also say is a downfall, but I don't think so. But Ken realizes that in the beginning, both Barbie's and Ken's are, and this is where the messaging on gender comes in, is it's a strict binary between Barbie's and Ken's. And none of them are really individualized. And of course, the whole movie is about a fight for individualization. Now, the question is, do you do that individualization under a larger superstructure of Barbies and Kens? And the movie categorically says no. In the end, it's not becoming Barbie and Ken. It's becoming Barbie and becoming Ken. It's Barbie and it's Ken. It's not Barbie and Ken and they've been subsumed under the phallocentric matrix again, but rather that they've achieved true individuality by breaking out of these categories of Barbie and Ken. And of course, throughout this, there's obviously individualization occurring. And in a sense, you might look at, for example, the end scene when they reinstate the Constitution, that the Barbies they've been subsumed under the Barbie label again. They've broken out of, the patriarchy, but of course they're still subsumed under the binary category of all being Barbies. But that is interestingly avoided by the fact that Alan is in there. And it shows, it's kind of like when Butler is talking about coalitional politics, where some people say that the best way to form a coalitional movement is to disband the categories and create a movement where its own categories have been made. But of course, Butler criticizes this because it merely reinstates categories again, and it's going to tend back towards a binary, especially if it exists in a phallocentric matrix. Now, by the end of the movie, when they've reinstated the Constitution and, reinstated the law in a sense, it's no longer a totalizing binary. It's no longer a universal of you're either Barbie or Ken. Yes, Barbies have banded together as women to subvert the phallocentric order. And in a sense, the Kens have done that too by individualizing themselves and achieving their own identity. But it's precisely by, they're operating under the discourse of binary categories of Ken and Barbie, but it loses its totalizing capabilities by the end, because it's no longer a mere question of Barbies fighting against Kens and Kens fighting against Barbies. The Kens start fighting against themselves, which is a super interesting Lacanian idea because, of course, Lacan talks about the totalizing phallocentric discourse, of course, is built around the phallus, the erect penis, as an image and as a subliminal message. And this is built around the suppression of desire. And maybe this is suppression of homosexual desire. Maybe this is merely the repression of the person's individuality. And in order to deal with this, they subsume themselves under these categories. But the Kens fight against themselves, which, Butler talks about this when she's talking about Lacanian gender trouble, is, in a sense, the phallus itself becomes the thing that's unrepresented. The feminine is the negative by which the phallus becomes the master, in a Hegelian sense of the master-slave dialectic. There's a binary opposition, but it's a hierarchical too. You've got a master who is the signifier, and you've got the slave, which is the signified. And the problem is this creates a unstable discourse where really neither identity is confirmed in a significant way, because the negative, the feminine in this case, the one that actually becomes the phallus by which the masculine can see itself reflected, it doesn't really have its identity served, precisely because it just exists in a mirror stage of having itself mirrored, but not actually seeing itself as an individual. It's a pure universal. And this is the spot where we can really read this in a Heideggerian sense too, because it's clear from the very beginning, and it doesn't take much reading to get to this, that Barbie is consumed in das Man, in the they, the structure of discourse structured by society in general, or the other, which is the other Barbies. And she starts to confront the fact that she is an individual quite early on when she confronts death, which is such a Heideggerian thing to say. Heidegger is all about learning to face death with anticipatory resoluteness and learning to face death as an individual rather than being subsumed under a totalizing structure that gets rid of your ability to really face the fact. I mean, Ruth says something near the end that I can't remember about, she says that all humans have to confront death, and that we come up with ideas like the patriarchy to sort of create a discourse that distracts from death. And she's not saying that the patriarchy doesn't exist, but that it gets subsumed under the idea of death. And in a sense, and in a Lacanian sense, human life is a suppression of death, which constitutes gender. And the whole movie opens up right here, because now it's not merely a story of feminists coming out by becoming, a natural woman, as what's her name said, "You make me feel like a natural woman." They're not Barbies all anymore. They're their own people. And Barbie, the stereotypical Barbie, which is such an interesting way to describe her character, is no longer a Barbie at all, but she is a human who, of course, if we're thinking in a Heideggerian sense, is now Dasein. And Dasein, one of Dasein's basic constitutions, is that it faces death, at least in its authentic manner. And, this is the whole power of the euphoria of the movie, is you start thinking about your death too, and you start thinking about how can I anticipate my death in a way in which it contributes to my life, but doesn't detract from my life by making me depressed. And of course, this is the mom's problem throughout, is she is faced with herself in a real existential manner, and she's faced with the fact that femininity is commodified in a phallogocentric discourse, right? She has to be perfect. She has to be commanding and a boss, but she can't be a prick about it. And she has to be thin, but she can't care about being thin. And she can't be fat, but she also can't be too skinny. She has to be just right. All this stuff about femininity has been universalized, but in a very particular way, because it's structured in such a way where, there are ways of being a woman in a society. But these, of course, have obviously been structured by the phallus, by the male understanding of the way women are supposed to be. Supposed to be in the home, and supposed to care for the kids, and, supposed to not be in STEM fields or what have you. And all of the sudden, this universalizing discourse is opened up to each Barbie individually as something faulty, something that has been created by men. And the Kens go on to realize this too. And in the fight scene, even, you can see one of the men, he's got one of those horse heads on a stick that you ride when you're a kid. And he's doing mouth to mouth to it, reviving it, trying to revive the phallus. How interesting. Even when, Butler talks about the fact that ultimately the phallogocentric discourse is kind of a circus and it's faulty And it's absurd in a very overt manner, because it's not actually identity at all. It's partial identity that relies on repression, whether that be of a slave in a Hegelian sense, or whether that be of the feminine, or whether that be of the phallus in a Lacanian sense, where men suppress themselves, which of course this is occurring all the time in the modern day of, men trying to get in touch with their feelings and learn to become more authentic people rather than being subsumed under their own discourse. In a sense, the feminine message has spread outside of itself, that in order for men to be true men, they have to subsume the feminist understanding of individuality. But of course, that can be a problem if it becomes appropriated, because now this only serves to, of course, bolster men as more manly, as extra phallogocentric. So the movie becomes so interesting when the Kens are faced with the absurdity of the discourse they've created, which in the Barbie movie, the Kens, in a sense, play the role that historically has been played by women, of being the negative, of being that which confirms the identity of Barbies. Barbies are these perfect creatures that the Kens serve to give a role, to act against. Barbies have a sense of identity, but only as a universal community that is pushed against the Kens. And precisely, no one has an identity anymore, because they're subsumed under a hopeless universal that has no individuality. And as soon as we realize this, we see that the whole movie is about deconstructing gender as a binary and allowing people to, in a very Heideggerian sense, face their death as the primal constitutive factor that's going to give them any sorts of genuine identity, rather than just being subsumed under a phallogocentric discourse where the phallus is just repressing itself to hide the fact of it not even really being a thing. It's, in the Lacanian discourse, the phallus it's not even a thing. It's its own impossibility, just like the subject for Lacan is precisely the subject insofar as it is its own impossibility. And in a sense, the feminine, we can think of, Beauvoir talking about one becomes a woman, or I think it was Irigaray or someone that was talking about, strictly speaking, women are impossible. The idea that by becoming a negative and by being a subject who has been destroyed as a universal, no longer has any identity at all. And this is the real power of the movie, is it's all about restructuring identity outside of a binary discourse, precisely because the revolution happens both ways. And I'm left in awe of the movie because it clearly pays attention to these symbols. The horse being instituted in so many subliminal ways. I can't help but thinking that the filmmakers had this in mind, or maybe this just speaks to the power of the symbol broadly speaking, and in a sort of structuralist way, this has evolved anthropologically to invade every part of our discourse. So that's it.